Hello. I'm going to be reading 3 brief essays. They're from an essay collection called You Can't See What You Don't See, which I wrote last fall, which was much colder than this. And the collection consists of 3 months of daily essays, and these 3 come from September, which I wrote every day in response to a small decorative squash which I kept on my writing table, and each day I would write and respond to it in writing in a different way. And these are 3 examples from that. September 1st. Factual. It is a squash, or perhaps a gourd. It is approximately the same shape and size as my 6-month-old son's head. However, the gourd, or squash, is lopsided. My son's head is not. If my son's head were as lopsided as the squash, we would have called the neurologist a long time ago, and our son likely would be wearing one of those soft, skull-correcting helmets that resemble the headgear amateur boxers wear. I suspect the squash, let's call it a squash, also weighs about as much as my son's head. The average adult's head weighs 8 pounds, although I suspect my own noggin, wide and heavy-jawed and dorsally ridged like some head-butting dinosaurs, likely weighs more than 8. My guess is the squash weighs less than 8 pounds, although how much less I'm not sure. Shifting the squash back and forth from palm to palm, I'm reminded of Harrison Ford at the beginning of the first Indiana Jones movie, trying to gauge the weight of the Aztec, Incan, Mayan relic, resting atop some sort of spring-loaded, weight-sensitive trap, then filling a small bag with what he hopes is the same weight of silt. He estimates the weight incorrectly. Things go poorly after that. Fortunately, my son's head, unlike the squash, is not topped with a brief, desiccated stem. If it were, we would have had more than a neurologist to call, and the paparazzi would be perched in the trees outside our house with their long, snouted cameras, looking to snap a photo of the pumpkin baby. By the way, the gourd/squash in some respects resembles a pumpkin more than it does a squash or gourd, hence the name ambiguity. It doesn't have the long-bellied, curved-necked shape of gourds, which I don't think you're supposed to eat unless you're into flavorless pith. And it doesn't look like the thick-skinned cucumber, which is more or less my mental image of a squash. Rather, it's the sort of cute, softball-sized objet that sells for $1 the day after Halloween, which is, by the way, in exactly 2 months, All Saints' Day, at which point I suspect the squash/gourd will look more or less exactly the same as it does today. Yet another reason to be suspicious of eating it. Nothing you eat should last unshriveled, unrotted, and unrancid for 2 months. See hamburger, McDonald's. Were the squash orange, I would, despite my skimpy knowledge of botany, be confident in calling it a pumpkin, but instead it's a variegated, two-toned green and cream. 10,000 blanched bits burbling up through a pine-colored sea, along with a few hundred larger blotches, ranging in size from BB to P. The squash has no smell. A handful of vertical ridges like longitude lines divide the squash into wedges, each ridge extending from one of the stem's feet. The ridges are the darkest portions of the squash, unoccluded by the set of larger cream splotches, while the palest portions are near the nadir of its southern hemisphere, the squash's Antarctica. Perhaps the green is a sort of vegetable melanin, and the squash's unsunned southern hemisphere is, ironically, the same color as the skin of the northernmost Europeans. The only other ungreened swath is a tennis ball-sized patch along the equator, scarred with a few rope-colored slashes. It reminds me of the bald spot on the back of my infant nephew's head, the hair worn away by his mattress. Pediatricians warn you not to put babies to sleep on their bellies. My wife does not listen to pediatricians, which is perhaps why her son has no bald spot. Then again, he has little hair to lose. The bald spot is quite common with babies, and, if my memory serves correctly, also with vine-grown, ground-creeping fruit. Squash, gourds, watermelon, pumpkins. each of which always seems to have a frog-bellied patch underneath. As with the watermelon or cantaloupe, one of my first urges after picking up the squash, particularly after noticing its pleasing density, was to rap it with my knuckles, which makes a reverberant thonking, not a pediatrician-recommended technique with the heads of small children. I've hit it 100 or more times, testing the higher-pitched polar caps and the lower equatorial tones. All of it seems to suggest there is more inside than outside, and so I knock on, as though telling the squash, "Let me in." September 2nd. Aspirational, inspirational. The squash wishes it could be green all over green, the green of a Christmas tree farm seen from above, but it's flacked with paleness, awash in pimples and wens, a bleached rosacea, the same sour milk shade. It boggles the mind to think people choose to paint the color of office buildings. It longs to look like the acorn squash, clothed like an army officer in virile hunter green, but at a distance it's a watery yellow, the color of an untended fish tank. But all things are more interesting close up. Mind and eye would tire quickly of the unbroken green of an acorn squash. Uniformity is not beauty. Hopkins wrote, "Glory be to God for dappled things," and in the dapple of the squash are the bubble trails of scuba divers, the freckles of an arm more freckled than not, the Marin County landscape muscly with hills, its golden slopes lovelier for the stipple of wizened trees floating atop them. Not sour milk, but the Milky Way. September 9th. Sonic. Squash. Feel the word in your mouth, that first S whispering like the head of a match against the striking strip, just before the ignition that is the back of the tongue, impacting the hard palate, sparking the combustion of the central vowel, filling the mouth cavity so fully that it forces your jaw further open, only for the sound to collapse back on itself, fading into the shush of the shh. It is the sound a can of Coke makes when you open it. On a grander scale, it is the soundtrack of the tide. The hiss of 100 million tiny bubbles bursting, the sound of Rice Krispies when you pour in the milk, if the bowl was the Pacific. The hard sea of the cresting, the vowely wind howling in the hollow under the wave, the soft crash of water on sand. The verb form is an almost perfect onomatopoeia, conjuring the image of a child pancaking an overripe tomato into a tabletop. Merely saying it gives a similarly textural pleasure, like digging your hands through a bowl of popcorn kernels. It is unfortunate we relegate to toddlers and poets the mouth pleasure of our language.